I'm Vincent, 43, and for 2 decades I've carried the weight of my mother's betrayal like a stone in my chest. At 19, I sat in a courtroom watching the woman who raised me take the witness stand, not to defend me, but to testify against me in a case that would shatter my future. Her words sent me to prison for 3 years for a crime that tore our family apart. I rebuilt my life from nothing, became a successful victim's advocate, married a wonderful woman, raised 2 beautiful children. But the question never left me. Why did she lie? Last month, as she lay dying in hospice, my mother finally spoke. The truth. What she told me didn't just explain her betrayal. It revealed a family secret so devastating that I understood, for the first time, why she chose to sacrifice me to protect someone else. The truth changed everything I thought I knew about justice, forgiveness, and the price of a mother's love. If you've carried the weight of family betrayal, like and subscribe, because some truths are worth waiting 20 years to hear. The high school graduation photo still sits in a box in my closet, yellowed at the edges, but preserved like evidence of a different life. In it, I'm flanked by my parents, all 3 of us beaming with pride. My mother's hand rests on my shoulder, her eyes bright with the kind of love that makes a mother believe her child can conquer the world. My father stands tall beside us, his smile genuine in a way I rarely saw in later years. We look like the perfect American family middle class, hopeful, unbroken. I was their golden child, the son who validated every sacrifice they'd made. While other kids in our neighborhood struggled with grades or got into trouble, I brought home honor roll certificates and college acceptance letters. My mother would frame each achievement, creating a shrine to my potential on the living room wall. She'd tell anyone who'd listen about my plans to study business administration, about the scholarship I'd earned, about the bright future that stretched ahead of us all. What I didn't know then was how desperately my parents needed that future to be real. They hid their financial struggles behind closed doors and forced smiles. The house payments that kept them awake at night, the credit card statements they shuffled like a shell game, the way my father's hand shook when he thought no one was. Looking, all of it was carefully concealed from their precious son who was going to lift the family out of their quiet desperation. I remember the night everything changed with startling clarity. It was 3 weeks before graduation, and I'd come home late from my part-time job at the Riverside Community Foundation, a small nonprofit where I filed paperwork and answered phones for $8 an hour. The house was dark, except for the kitchen light, and I could hear my parents' voices rising and falling in the urgent rhythm of an argument they thought they were having privately. I froze in the hallway, my hand on the light switch, as fragments of their conversation drifted toward me. Words like bankruptcy and foreclosure hit me like physical blows. My mother was crying, not the delicate tears of a movie heroine, but the raw, desperate sobs of someone watching their world collapse. My father's voice was hollow when he spoke, talking about amounts of money that seemed impossible, about debts that had somehow grown beyond their ability to manage. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the family. I thought I knew with the reality I'd accidentally discovered. My parents had built their entire identity around being providers, around giving me opportunities they'd never had. The thought that they were failing, that their financial house of cards was about to tumble down just as I was supposed to launch into adulthood, must have been unbearable. If I'd been older, wiser, perhaps I would have knocked on their bedroom door and told them I'd overheard. Maybe we could have faced the crisis together, found a way to navigate the storm as a family. Instead, I pretended I knew nothing, maintaining the fiction that allowed them to keep protecting me from the truth. It was a decision that would haunt all of us, because sometimes the kindest lies become the cruelest foundations for tragedy. The police report still exists somewhere in a filing cabinet. A manila folder contained the first domino in a chain reaction that would destroy everything I thought I knew about family, justice, and truth. I've requested copies over the years, studying the inconsistencies like a detective working a cold case, searching for clues that might have saved me if anyone had bothered to look closer. The crime was elegantly simple in its apparent clarity. $12,000 had disappeared from the Riverside Community Foundation's General Operating Fund over a period of 6 months. Small amounts at first, 200 here, 500 there, transactions that might have gone unnoticed, if not for a new accounting system that flagged unusual patterns. The thefts were methodical, professional almost, targeting accounts that wouldn't be audited for months. When the Foundation's director, Mrs. Chun, called me into her office that Tuesday morning in June, I assumed she wanted to discuss my summer work schedule. Instead, I found her sitting across from 2 detectives whose faces held the grim satisfaction of people who believe they've solved a puzzle. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The thefts had occurred during my shifts. Money had been withdrawn using access codes only I possessed, and deposits matching the stolen amounts had appeared in a bank account that somehow bore my name. I remember the moment my world tilted off its axis. Detective Morrison, a tired-looking man with kind eyes that seemed apologetic about what he had to do, spread the bank statements across Mrs. Chun's desk like tarot cards predicting a dark future. There was my signature, or something that looked convincingly like it. There were deposits that corresponded exactly to the missing funds. There was documentation that painted me as a calculating thief who had systematically betrayed the trust of an organization dedicated to helping others. "Vincent," Detective Morrison said gently, "we need you to come with us to answer some questions." The words seemed to echo from a great distance. I stared at the papers, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The signatures looked like mine but felt foreign, as if someone had traced my handwriting while I slept. The account information was correct, my social security number, my address, even my middle initial, but I had never opened that account, never seen those statements, never touched a penny of the Foundation's money. "There's been a mistake," I said, my voice sounding thin and unconvincing even to my own ears. "I didn't do this. I would never." But the evidence spoke louder than my protests. As they read me my rights in the back of their unmarked car, I kept thinking about my parents, about how this would destroy the future they'd sacrificed so much to build. I thought about my mother's proud smile in that graduation photo, and how it would crumble when she learned that her perfect son was just another criminal who'd thrown away his opportunities for quick money. When I called home from the police station, my mother's voice cracked with disbelief. "There has to be an explanation," she kept saying. "Vincent would never steal. He's a good boy. He would never hurt anyone like that." I could hear my father in the background, asking questions she couldn't answer, his voice rising with the kind of panic that comes when your worst fears suddenly seem prophetic. That night, released on bail that nearly bankrupted my parents, I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by trophies and certificates that now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. My mother brought me dinner on a tray, her hand shaking as she set it down. "We'll figure this out," she promised, kissing my forehead the way she had when I was small and frightened by thunderstorms. "The truth always comes out. We just have to be patient and trust that justice will prevail." I believed her then. I believed in the system, in the power of innocence to protect itself, in the impossible faith that families stick together when the world turns dark. I had no way of knowing that the person I trusted most was already planning the testimony that would send me to prison. The court transcript from that day runs 47 pages long. I know because I've read every word countless times, studying my mother's testimony like a scholar analyzing a text that holds the key to understanding human nature itself. Page 31 contains the moment that shattered my faith in everything I believed about love, loyalty, and the bonds that tie families together. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more like a classroom than the grand halls of justice. I'd imagined from television. I sat at the defendant's table in a suit my parents had bought for college interviews, trying to project the innocence I felt, but couldn't seem to prove. My lawyer, a public defender named Mr. Hoffman, who carried too many cases and too little hope, had warned me that the prosecution's case was strong. But he'd also said families don't testify against their own children without extraordinary circumstances. He was right about that last part, though not in the way any of us expected. When my mother's name was called to the witness stand, I felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone who knew me, who could speak to my character, who could tell these strangers that the son they'd raised would never steal from people who trusted him. She walked to the front of the courtroom with her shoulders straight, wearing the navy dress she saved for church and important occasions. Her hands were steady as she placed one on the Bible and raised the other to swear that she would tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman who seemed to view my case as a simple matter of paperwork, began with routine questions. My mother confirmed her relationship to me, established that she lived in the same house and would have opportunities to observe my behavior. Her voice was clear and strong, the voice of a woman who had raised a son she was proud of. Then the questions changed direction. Mrs. Henderson, did you notice any changes in your son's behavior in the months leading up to his arrest? My mother hesitated for just a moment, her eyes finding mine across the courtroom. In that pause, I saw something I couldn't quite interpret: apology, perhaps, or the kind of pain that comes from making an impossible choice. Yes, she said quietly. Vincent had been acting differently, more secretive. He was coming home late from work, and when I asked about it, he would become defensive. The words hit me like physical blows. I had been working late, but only because Mrs. Chun had asked me to help with a filing project. I had mentioned it to my mother multiple times, even complained about the extra hours cutting into my social time. Did you observe anything else unusual? I found money in his room, my mother said, her voice growing stronger as if she'd found her resolve. Cash hidden in his drawer. When I asked about it, he said he'd been saving tips from work, but the foundation doesn't take tips. It's a non-profit organization. The prosecutor nodded, making notes. How much money did you find? Nearly $800, all in 20s and 50s, rubber banded together and hidden under his clothes. I stared at my mother in complete bewilderment. There had been no money hidden in my room. I kept my small savings in a checking account, money I'd earned from legitimate work and occasional gifts from relatives. The cash she described had never existed, yet she was describing it with the kind of detail that could only come from actual observation. Mrs. Henderson, on the evening of March 15th, did you see your son with any unusual items? My mother's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I saw him counting money at his desk. A lot of money. More than a teenager should have from a part-time job. When he heard me coming, he shoved it into an envelope and hid it quickly. March 15th. I remembered that date because it was my girlfriend's birthday, and I'd spent the evening at her house with her family. I had an alibi for every detail my mother was describing, yet she was delivering her testimony with the conviction of someone who had witnessed these events firsthand. The questioning continued for another 20 minutes, each answer driving another nail into the coffin of my defense. My mother described behavior I'd never exhibited, conversations we'd never had, evidence of guilt that existed only in her testimony. She never looked at me directly as she spoke, keeping her eyes focused on the prosecutor or the judge, as if meeting my gaze might somehow undermine the terrible thing she was doing. When my lawyer stood to cross-examine her, I felt a flicker of hope. Surely he would expose the inconsistencies, reveal the impossibility of her timeline, show the jury that something was fundamentally wrong with her story. Instead, my mother held firm to every detail. When Mr. Hoffman pressed her about dates and times, she provided them with precision. When he questioned her about the hidden money, she described the exact location and denominations with unwavering certainty. She was either telling the truth or she was the most convincing liar I'd ever encountered. As she stepped down from the witness stand, my mother finally looked at me. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her expression was resolute, as if she'd done something necessary but heartbreaking. She mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," so quietly that only I could see, then walked back to her seat beside my father, who sat with his head buried in his hands. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with their verdict, I was still trying to understand what had happened, still believing that some last-minute revelation would make sense of the senseless. The foreman's voice was steady as he pronounced me guilty on all counts, and I felt the last of my childhood innocence evaporate in that sterile courtroom air. As the bailiff led me away in handcuffs, I caught one final glimpse of my mother. She was crying openly now, her composed facade finally cracking under the weight of what she'd done. But she had done it nonetheless, choosing some greater loyalty over the son she'd claimed to love more than her own life. It would be 20 years before I understood that sometimes the cruelest betrayals are born from the deepest love, and that the truth can be more devastating than any lie. The letter arrived 3 days after I entered Millbrook Correctional Facility, delivered with the casual indifference of prison mail call. My mother's handwriting on the envelope looked smaller than I remembered, as if the act of writing my name on a letter addressed to an inmate had diminished her somehow. I held that envelope for hours before finding the courage to open it, hoping against logic that it would contain an explanation that made sense, an apology that could begin to heal the wound her testimony had carved into my heart. Instead, I found 4 sentences that I would memorize despite every effort to forget them. Vincent, I know you must hate me right now, and I understand why. What I did was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, but I had to tell the truth as I saw it. I hope someday you'll understand that everything I did was because I love you. Please take care of yourself and know that I pray for you every day. The truth as she saw it. The phrase haunted me through those first brutal weeks when survival required every ounce of mental energy I possessed. Prison was nothing like the sanitized versions I'd seen in movies. It was a world of constant threat, where showing weakness could get you killed, and showing strength could get you killed just as easily. I was 19 years old, college-bound until a week ago, suddenly navigating a universe where the wrong look at the wrong person could result in violence that the guards would conveniently fail to witness. My cellmate was a man named Jerome, who'd been inside for 8 years on an armed robbery conviction. He was built like a linebacker, with scars that told stories I never asked him to share. But something in his eyes suggested that violence wasn't his preferred method of communication. On my 3rd night, as I lay awake listening to the sounds of men who'd forgotten how to sleep peacefully, Jerome's voice cut through the darkness. "You got that look," he said quietly. "Like you can't figure out how you ended up here. Most guys, they know they earned their spot. But you keep staring at that letter like it holds the answer to some question that don't make sense." I didn't respond, but Jerome continued anyway. "Whatever happened out there, whoever did you wrong, you got to let that poison go, or it'll eat you alive in here. Prison's got enough ways to break a man without carrying extra weight." But I couldn't let it go. Every night, I replayed the courtroom scene, dissecting my mother's testimony word by word, searching for clues I'd missed. The money she claimed to have found, the secretive behavior she described, the timeline that placed me at home when I could prove I was elsewhere. None of it made sense, unless she had deliberately constructed a lie so detailed and convincing that even experienced prosecutors accepted it without question. The why consumed me. My mother had raised me with stories about family loyalty, about how blood bonds were sacred and unbreakable. She taught me that families protected each other, that love meant standing together against the world when necessary. Yet she had stood in a courtroom and delivered testimony that she had to know would send me to prison. Jerome watched me deteriorate for 2 weeks before he intervened again. "You writing letters?" he asked one evening as I sat on my bunk, staring at a blank piece of paper. "Trying to," I admitted. "I want to write to my mother, ask her to explain what really happened, but I don't know what to say." "Maybe that's your answer right there," Jerome said. "Maybe you don't say nothing. Maybe you focus on what you can control instead of what you can't." He was right, though it took me months to accept his wisdom. Gradually, I began to engage with the prison's educational programs, partly to fill the endless hours, and partly because learning felt like reclaiming some piece of the future that had been stolen from me. I earned my GED within 6 months, then began taking college courses through a program that offered inmates a chance to work toward degrees. The teacher who changed my life was Dr. Patricia Weston, a criminology professor from the State University who volunteered her time to teach courses on criminal justice and victim advocacy. She was a small woman with gray hair and fierce intelligence, someone who looked at prisoners and saw human beings rather than just their crimes. During our first class, she asked each student to write an essay about their path to incarceration. I wrote about the confusion of being convicted for something I didn't do, about a justice system that seemed more interested in closing cases than finding truth, about a family that had abandoned me when I needed them most. I expected Dr. Weston to respond with sympathy or platitudes about rehabilitation. Instead, she challenged me to think deeper. "Vincent," she said during office hours, "your essay focuses entirely on what was done to you. That's understandable, given your circumstances. But if you want to find meaning in this experience, you need to consider what you can do for others who face similar situations." She introduced me to the concept of victim advocacy, to the idea that people who'd been failed by the system might be uniquely positioned to help others navigate its complexities. Through her program, I began working with incoming inmates, helping them understand their rights and connect with resources. I discovered that I had a talent for listening, for helping people process trauma and make sense of experiences that seemed senseless. The work gave me purpose, but it couldn't fill the void left by my mother's betrayal. Every success felt hollow when measured against the fundamental question that remained unanswered. Why had the woman who raised me chosen to destroy me? Her monthly letters, brief and careful, never provided the explanation I desperately needed. She wrote about weather and neighborhood news, about prayers and hopes for my future, but never about the testimony that had put me behind bars. By my second year, I'd stopped reading her letters, though I kept them in a box under my bunk like evidence in a case I might someday have the strength to solve. Jerome, who became something like a mentor despite the strange circumstances of our friendship, warned me that unresolved anger was a luxury I couldn't afford in prison. "You gotta make peace with not knowing," he told me one day as we worked together in the prison library, helping other inmates with their legal research. "Some questions don't get answered on this side of heaven, but you can choose what kind of man you become while you're waiting." He was right, but letting go of the need to understand felt like betraying myself. My mother's betrayal had become the defining event of my young life, the wound around which everything else had to be organized. Learning to live without understanding why felt impossible, like learning to breathe underwater or seeing complete darkness. What I didn't know then was that some truths are too heavy to carry alone, and that my mother was drowning under the weight of a secret that would eventually surface when death stripped away her ability to protect the person she'd sacrificed me to save. The GED certificate hangs in my home office now, 24 years after I earned it in a prison classroom that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. It's printed on simple paper, nothing fancy, but it represents something more valuable than any diploma I might have received from college, proof that identity can be rebuilt even when everything you thought you knew about yourself has been shattered. Dr. Weston had been right about finding purpose in pain, though it took me nearly a year to fully embrace her philosophy. The turning point came during my second winter at Millbrook, when a new inmate named Tommy arrived with the kind of raw desperation I recognized from my own early days. He was barely 18, convicted of drug dealing in a case where he'd been caught with substances that belonged to his older brother. Like me, he insisted on his innocence. Unlike me, he had no family at all, no mother to write letters, however inadequate, no father to put money in his commissary account. Tommy had attempted suicide twice in county jail before his transfer to Millbrook. When I met him in Dr. Weston's criminology class, he sat in the back corner with his head down, picking at the scabs on his knuckles until they bled. Something about his defeated posture reminded me of my own reflection during those first months, when I'd stopped recognizing the person staring back at me from the metal mirrors in our cells. "This is all garbage," Tommy muttered during a discussion about rehabilitation programs. "They got us in here for things we didn't do, and now they want us to pretend like we can learn our way out of being criminals. It's a joke." Dr. Weston didn't argue with him. Instead, she assigned him to work with me on a research project about wrongful convictions, pairing his anger with my growing understanding of how the system operated. Over the course of several weeks, Tommy and I dove deep into case studies of people who'd been exonerated after years in prison, examining the factors that led to their convictions and the long battles required to prove their innocence. The work was eye-opening for both of us, but for different reasons. Tommy discovered that his situation, while tragic, wasn't unique. Thousands of people were incarcerated for crimes they didn't commit, victims of prosecutorial ambition, inadequate defense, or simple bad luck. For me, the research provided a framework for understanding my own case, a way to see my mother's betrayal as part of a larger pattern of how families could be destroyed by a system that prioritized convictions over truth. But more importantly, the project gave me my first glimpse of how personal trauma could be transformed into advocacy for others. Tommy began attending every educational program the prison offered, channeling his anger into preparation for the legal appeals he was determined to pursue. I found myself naturally falling into a mentoring role, helping him navigate the bureaucracy and emotional challenges of prison life. "You got a gift for this," Jerome observed one evening as he watched me help another inmate write a letter to his children. "Most guys in here, they either get harder or they break. But you're getting stronger and softer at the same time, if that makes sense." It did make sense, though I couldn't have articulated it then. The betrayal that had destroyed my faith in family had somehow opened space for a different kind of connection, relationships built on shared struggle rather than blood, on choice rather than obligation. In prison, I learned that family could be constructed from the most unlikely materials. That loyalty could exist between people who'd never shared a history outside of concrete walls and steel bars. Dr. Weston noticed the change in me as well. During my final year, she recommended me for a position as a peer counselor, working with inmates who were struggling with mental health issues or family problems. The work was unpaid, of course, but it provided structure and meaning that helped. The days passed with purpose rather than mere endurance. My first official client was a man named Carlos, who'd been convicted of domestic violence and was wrestling with shame so profound that he'd stopped speaking to anyone, including his court-appointed therapist. Carlos had grown up in an abusive household and had never learned healthy ways to express anger or frustration. When his own relationship became volatile, he'd repeated the patterns he'd learned as a child, resulting in assault charges that would keep him incarcerated for 4 years. "I don't deserve help," Carlos told me during our first session, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hurt someone I loved. I became the monster I spent my whole childhood hating." Working with Carlos taught me that healing wasn't about forgetting. the past or minimizing harm, but about understanding the complex factors that lead people to make destructive choices. His case was different from mine. He was guilty of the charges against him, but his struggle to forgive himself and build a different future resonated with my own journey toward accepting circumstances I couldn't change. The GED certificate in my folder represented more than academic achievement. It was evidence that transformation was possible, that even the most devastating betrayals could be alchemized into purpose. If you were willing to do the work of rebuilding yourself from the ground up. The apartment lease sits in my file cabinet now. 3 pages of legal language that transformed me from inmate to tenant with the scratch of a pen. Unit 4B at Riverside Gardens became my first home as a free man after 3 years behind bars. Efficiency Studio, 400 square feet. Monthly rent of $485 that consumed most of my income from the dishwashing job that was the only employment I could find with a felony record. Walking out of Millbrook on that gray March morning felt surreal, like emerging from a movie theater into unexpected daylight. Dr. Weston had driven 3 hours to pick me up, a kindness that meant more than I could express. "How do you feel?" she asked as we drove away from the facility. "Terrified," I admitted. "In prison, I knew the rules. Out here, I'm a felon applying for jobs, trying to find an apartment, starting over at 22 with no family and no real connections." Finding housing took 3 weeks and dozens of rejections. The apartment I finally secured came through a program that worked with formerly incarcerated individuals. Unit 4B was everything I could afford, and nothing I would have chosen stained. Carpet, barely functional kitchen, cracked bathroom mirror. But it was mine. Employment was even more challenging. The dishwashing job at Murphy's Family Restaurant came through a re-entry program. My supervisor, Linda, was blunt. "I don't care what you did. What I care about is whether you show up on time and work hard." The isolation was crushing. Evenings in my studio apartment stretched endlessly. My parents had moved while I was incarcerated, leaving no forwarding address. Whatever shame my conviction had caused them, they decided that cutting ties completely was preferable to maintaining a relationship with their criminal son. Dr. Weston remained my primary connection to purpose. During one dinner, she mentioned Second Chances, an organization providing support services for formerly incarcerated individuals. "They're looking for someone with lived experience," she said, sliding a business card across the table. Second Chances operated out of a converted warehouse, filled with passionate energy. The director, Carmen, interviewed me in an office decorated with thank you letters from former clients. "This job doesn't pay well," Carmen said, "but if you're serious about advocacy work, this could be the beginning of a career that makes a real difference." The position paid $12 an hour, but it offered something invaluable: the chance to use my experience to help others. My first client was Raymond, who'd served 8 years for armed robbery and was struggling with severe depression. "I don't know how to do this," Raymond told me. "Everything feels impossible." Listening to Raymond, I heard echoes of my own struggles, but I also recognized how much I'd grown. The hardest part is accepting that rebuilding takes time and that the life you create won't look like the one you had before. But that doesn't mean it can't be meaningful. 6 months into my work at Second Chances, I received an unexpected letter about my father's heart attack. When I called the hospital, the nurse said, "The family has requested that no information be released to unauthorized visitors." The rejection clarified something important. Whatever healing I needed would have to happen without my parents' participation. That night, sitting with case files from Second Chances, I felt something shift. The apartment lease represents more than my first home after prison. It's evidence that freedom means claiming the right to define yourself despite circumstances others use to limit your possibilities. The wedding ring I wear now is a simple gold band that Isabella and I picked out together. representing something I never thought possible after my family's betrayal. The ability to trust someone completely with the truth of who I am. That ring reminds me daily that love could exist without conditions, that families could be built on choice rather than blood. I met Isabella during my second year at Second Chances, when she started as a social worker specializing in family reunification cases. She had dark hair kept in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to see through pretense to whatever truth people were hiding. What drew me to her wasn't just her beauty, but her approach to broken people. She possessed optimism that wasn't naive, believing healing was possible even when evidence suggested otherwise. Our first real conversation happened during a staff meeting about Marcus, a former inmate struggling to regain custody of his daughter. The caseworker recommended against returning custody, citing concerns about stability. With respect, Isabella said, we're making decisions based on assumptions about who this man was, not evidence of who he's become. Don't we have an obligation to consider what continuous separation might do to both of them? After the meeting, I approached her. That was brave, standing up for Marcus when everyone else seemed ready to write him off. She smiled. I know what it's like to be judged for other people's mistakes. Sometimes the only difference between giving up and fighting back is having one person who believes you deserve a chance. Over weeks, our coffee conversations became more personal. I learned she'd grown up in foster care after her parents died, that she'd been separated from her younger brother for 6 years, that her passion for family reunification came from understanding the cost of broken connections. What about you? She asked one morning. What brought you to this work? I'd grown skilled at deflecting inquiries about my background, but something about Isabella's directness made deflection feel like cowardice. I was convicted of embezzlement. When I was 19, I said, watching her face for judgment. I spent 3 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. My own mother testified against me in court. Isabella didn't flinch. She simply nodded and said, that must have been devastating. How did you survive something like that? Her response was so accepting that I found myself telling her everything, the rest. The trial, my mother's betrayal, the years of rebuilding. I talked for nearly an hour, watching for signs she was reconsidering her interest in knowing me. Instead, Isabella reached across the table and briefly touched my hand. Thank you for trusting me with that. I can see why you're so good at helping other people navigate impossible situations. We dated for 8 months before I told her I loved her, and another 6 months before she moved into my upgraded apartment. Living together revealed the depth of damage we both carried. Isabella's hypervigilance about abandonment, my tendency to expect betrayal, but it also revealed our capacity for healing in safe relationship. The proposal happened on a Saturday morning in our kitchen. Nothing elaborate. I'd been thinking about marriage for months, but struggling with whether someone with my history had the right to ask someone to permanently link their life to mine. Isabella, I said as she made coffee, I know my past makes me a complicated partner, but I love you, and I want to build a life with you if you're willing. She turned around and looked at me with her characteristic directness. Vincent Henderson. Are you asking me to marry you? I am. Then yes. But we're picking out rings together, and we're having a small ceremony with people who actually know and support us. Our wedding was exactly what Isabella specified, small, authentic, surrounded by friends from work who understood the significance of 2 damaged people choosing to build something healthy together. Dr. Weston officiated. Carmen served as maid of honor, and Jerome was my best man. The absence of my biological family was notable but not devastating. We accepted that the family I'd been born into had chosen estrangement, and that the family I was creating with Isabella was built on stronger foundations. We exchanged vows acknowledging our histories while promising to support each other's continued growth. That night, wearing my new wedding ring, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. The security that comes from belonging somewhere, permanently. The ring represents more than marriage. It's evidence that trust can be rebuilt, that families can be chosen, that love is possible even after the deepest betrayals. The birth certificate for my son Michael sits in our family safe, but I remember holding it in the hospital with hands that shook from something deeper than exhaustion. August 15th, 2010. 7 pounds 3 ounces. As I stared at that document declaring me a father, I was overwhelmed by the terrifying question of whether I could be the parent I'd never had. Michael's arrival forced me to confront my childhood. Holding him, feeling his tiny fingers grip mine with unconscious trust, I realized parenthood would require modeling unconditional love I'd never experienced. Every decision felt monumental. How to respond when he cried, how to balance discipline with affection. Isabella adapted to motherhood with natural grace. Her foster care experience had taught her to recognize what children needed. I struggled more, constantly second-guessing my instincts and worrying that my lack of positive parenting models would damage my son. "You're overthinking this," Isabella said one evening as I watched Michael sleep. "He doesn't need perfect parents. He needs parents who love him and are committed to figuring it out." The crisis came when Michael was 6 months old. I was home alone when he began crying inconsolably. I tried everything, but nothing worked. For one terrifying moment, I understood how parents could lose control. I set Michael in his crib and called Isabella. "I don't know what's wrong," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm scared I'm going to become my father." Isabella came home immediately, discovered a thread wrapped around his toe, and resolved the problem within minutes. "Vincent," she said that evening, "you called for help when you felt overwhelmed." That's exactly what good parents do. When Michael was 8 months old, I hired a private investigator to locate my parents. I wrote a careful letter explaining that I was married, that I had a son they'd never met, hoping that grandparenthood might bridge the gap my conviction had created. The response came 6 weeks later. "We appreciate your letter and are glad. You're doing well. However, we have built a new life that doesn't include contact with our past. Please do not contact us again." There was no acknowledgement of Michael's existence, no curiosity about the life I'd built. That night marked a turning point. Instead of focusing on what I lacked in family models, I began appreciating what I could offer Michael based on my experiences. I understood unconditional acceptance because I'd lived without it. When Michael turned 2, we began trying for a second child. Our daughter Emma was born in 2013, completing our family and giving Michael the sibling relationship that had been important to Isabella's healing. Watching my children play together, seeing them develop secure attachment I'd missed, I began understanding that forgiveness might be less about pardoning past harm and more about refusing to let past pain determine future possibilities. My parents' abandonment had been devastating, but it had freed me to build family relationships based on health rather than obligation. The birth certificates represent more than documentation. They're evidence that cycles of dysfunction can be broken, that people failed by their families can succeed as parents, that love can be rebuilt even when original foundations are shattered. My children will grow up knowing age-appropriate versions of their parents' stories, understanding why we value honesty, resilience, and chosen family. They'll know their father spent time in prison for something he didn't do, but they'll also know they are wanted, protected, and loved without conditions. Gifts that became possible because of how betrayal taught me to recognize and create family bonds that can survive any crisis. To find me sitting on the kitchen floor with my head in my hands while Michael continued screaming in his room. She picked him up, discovered a thread from his clothing that had wrapped around his toe, cutting off circulation, and within minutes had resolved the problem that had left me feeling like a failed parent. "Vincent," she said as we sat together. That evening, Michael finally peaceful in her arms. "You called for help when you felt overwhelmed." That's exactly what good parents do. Your father never learned that skill, but you have. Her words helped, but they didn't entirely ease my anxiety about the kind of father I might become. The absence of my own parents felt particularly acute during those early months when most new fathers would have turned to their families for advice and support. I found myself wondering what my mother might have said about Michael's sleep schedule, whether my father might have offered wisdom about raising boys, how different our experience might have been if I'd had grandparents eager to spoil their first grandchild. The longing for family connection led to my first serious attempt at reconciliation since my release from prison. When Michael was 8 months old, I hired a private investigator to locate my parents, who had moved twice since my incarceration, and left no forwarding information with anyone I could reach. The investigator found them living in a retirement community 3 states away, apparently having rebuilt their lives around the fiction that they'd never had a son who disgraced the family. I wrote a careful letter explaining that I was married now, that I had a son they'd never met, that I understood their shame about my conviction, but hoped that time might have softened their position about maintaining contact. I included photographs of Michael and Isabella, hoping that the innocence of a grandchild might bridge the gap that my criminal record had created. The response came 6 weeks later, forwarded through the investigator to avoid giving me their direct address. It was typed on plain stationery, brief and formal as a business rejection. Vincent, we appreciate your letter and are glad to hear that you're doing well. However, we have built a new life that doesn't include contact with our past. We wish you happiness, but ask that you respect our decision not to pursue a relationship. Please do not contact us again. The letter was signed with both their names, but felt like it had been written by a stranger. There was no acknowledgement of Michael's existence, no curiosity about the life I'd built, no recognition that they were rejecting not just me, but an innocent grandchild who had no connection to whatever shame my conviction had caused them. Isabella found me that evening sitting in Michael's nursery, holding the letter and watching our son sleep. "I'm sorry," she said, sitting beside me. "I know you hoped they might want to be part of his life. I keep thinking about what kind of grandparents they might have been," I said. "Whether they would have spoiled him, taught him things I don't know, given him stories about his family history. But maybe it's better this way. Maybe he's better off not knowing grandparents who could abandon their own child." That night marked a turning point in my approach to fatherhood. Instead of focusing on what I lacked in terms of family models, I began to appreciate what I could offer Michael based on my own experiences with abandonment and recovery. I understood the importance of unconditional acceptance because I'd lived without it. I knew how to help people heal from trauma because I'd done the work myself. I could teach him about resilience, empathy, and the difference between families you're born into and families you choose to build. When Michael turned 2, Isabella and I made a decision that felt revolutionary given our backgrounds. We began trying for a second child. The choice represented a level of confidence in our parenting abilities and financial stability that neither of us had expected to achieve. Our daughter Emma was born in 2013, completing our family and giving Michael the sibling relationship that had been so important to Isabella's own healing. Watching my children play together, seeing them develop the kind of secure attachment that I'd missed in my own childhood, I began to understand that forgiveness might be less about pardoning past harm and more about refusing to let past pain determine future possibilities. My parents' abandonment had been devastating, but it had also freed me to build family relationships based on health rather than obligation. The birth certificates in our safe represent more than legal documentation of my children's existence. They're evidence that cycles of dysfunction can be broken. The people who've been failed by their families can learn to succeed as parents themselves. That love can be rebuilt even when its original foundations have been shattered. My children will grow up knowing their parents' stories age-appropriate versions that help them understand why we value honesty, resilience, and chosen family so highly. They'll know that their father spent time in prison for something he didn't do, that their maternal grandmothers never met them, that their family was built intentionally by people who refuse to let past trauma dictate future possibilities. But they'll also know that they are wanted, protected, and loved without conditions, gifts that became possible not despite my parents' betrayal, but because of how that betrayal taught me to recognize and create the kind of family bonds that can survive any crisis. The forgiveness I found wasn't from my parents, who never asked for it, but from myself, for the child who'd believed that his worth was conditional on never disappointing the people who claimed to love him. The award plaque hanging in my office reads Victim Advocate of the Year, presented to Vincent Henderson in recognition of exceptional service to crime victims and their families. The irony wasn't lost on me. I spent 15 years helping others heal from trauma, while carrying my own unresolved wound. By 2015, Second Chances had grown from a small nonprofit to a nationally recognized organization. My role evolved from caseworker to deputy executive director, overseeing initiatives serving thousands of formerly incarcerated individuals annually. I was invited to speak at conferences, quoted in articles about criminal justice reform, consulted by legislators, drafting re-entry legislation, standing at award ceremony podiums, looking out at audiences of judges, prosecutors, and advocates. I felt the weight of representing everyone who'd been written off by society. My speeches focused on transformation potential, second chances, and rehabilitation over punishment. What I didn't mention was the hollow feeling accompanying every professional triumph. The absence of people who should have been proudest of my accomplishments. The speaking engagements became regular, sharing lessons about resilience and redemption. I developed from victim to advocate, carefully editing details to protect family privacy. Audiences responded powerfully, especially formerly incarcerated individuals who saw proof their futures weren't predetermined by worst moments. After one Chicago presentation, a young woman approached tearfully. I was convicted of drug possession 3 years ago. I've been clean, working 2 jobs, but everywhere I apply, people see my record first. Your story makes me believe someday people will see my work instead of my mistakes. These interactions reminded me why advocacy mattered, but highlighted the ongoing impact of carrying unresolved family trauma. I could help others process criminal justice experiences, navigate re-entry challenges, rebuild damaged relationships, but couldn't apply those skills to my situation because those who wronged me had chosen permanent estrangement. Professional success created its own isolation. Colleagues knew about my record central to my credibility, but few understood the deeper wound of family betrayal. Most assumed someone who'd achieved my level of success must have found peace. With the past, Isabella sometimes grew frustrated with my inability to move beyond unanswerable questions. You've built an incredible life. You help people daily. You're an amazing father. Why can't you let go of their approval? The question missed the fundamental issue. This wasn't about seeking approval from people who'd rejected me, but understanding why the person who'd raised me chose to destroy me when I needed protection most. Professional success validated my worth to society, but couldn't answer the question that had shaped my adult life. The award plaque represents recognition pinnacle in my field, but also external validation's limitation when internal questions remain unanswered. No amount of professional success could resolve why my mother testified against me, why my parents chose permanent estrangement, why the family that raised me decided I was disposable when crisis tested their loyalty. At night, surrounded by awards and commendations, I felt profound loneliness accompanying unshared success. The people who should have celebrated my achievements had written me out of their story entirely, leaving me wondering whether any accomplishment could fill the space they'd left empty. The medical diagnosis arrived through a phone call I'd stopped expecting. It was a Tuesday evening in October 2017, and I was helping Emma with homework while Isabella prepared dinner and Michael practiced piano. The domestic tranquility made the jarring ring feel like an intrusion from another world. "Vincent?" The voice was unfamiliar, female, tentative. "This is Martha Caldwell. I was a neighbor of your parents when you were growing up. I got your number from the private investigator you hired." My chest tightened. In the decades since my parents had rejected my reconciliation attempt, I'd received no communication from anyone connected to my childhood. "Mrs. Caldwell, is everything all right?" She hesitated. "Vincent, I'm calling because your mother is very sick. She has pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors are saying maybe 3 months." The words hit with unexpected force. 24 years of estrangement should have insulated me from caring, but the reality of her mortality brought emotions I wasn't prepared to process. Anger at abandonment, grief for the relationship we'd never had, and desperate need to understand why she destroyed our family before it was too late. How is she handling it? She's scared. And she's been asking about you. She wanted to know if you were doing well, if you were married, if you had children. I think she wants to reach out, but doesn't know how after all these years. After hanging up, I sat trying to process what I'd learned. Isabella found me staring at the paper where I'd written my mother's oncologist's name and their facility address. "What happened?" Isabella asked. I told her about the call, about my mother's diagnosis, about Mrs. Caldwell's suggestion that reconciliation might be possible. Isabella processed the information, understanding both opportunity and danger. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know. Part of me thinks she made her choice 24 years ago. Why should her terminal diagnosis change that? And the other part?" "The other part knows that if I don't try now, I'll never get answers to the questions that have haunted my entire adult life." After a week of debate, I contacted the oncologist. Dr. Patricia Ruiz was professional but cautious, confirming the terminal prognosis and that my mother had expressed interest in contacting family. Many patients facing terminal diagnoses feel urgency about resolving unfinished relationships. She said carefully, "If you decide to visit, be prepared for a range of emotions and outcomes." The drive to their assisted living facility took 4 hours of building anxiety. Sunset Manor was well maintained, designed for dignity and comfort. The receptionist's professional smile couldn't hide curiosity about visitors arriving off schedule. "I'm here to see Margaret Henderson." She checked her computer, then looked up with surprise. "Are you Vincent? She's been hoping you'd come." The woman who answered the door bore only superficial resemblance to the mother I remembered. Cancer had aged her beyond her 74 years, stealing weight and color and fierce determination. But her eyes held the same intelligence, along with vulnerability that acknowledged the enormity of what we were attempting. "Vincent," she said quietly, "you came." I did. That first visit lasted 2 hours and accomplished nothing except establishing communication was possible. We talked carefully around central issues: my conviction, her testimony, decades of silence. She asked about work, family, health, as if we were distant relatives rather than mother and son confronting lifetime estrangement. But something had changed in simply sitting in the same room. The mythical figure who'd haunted my dreams had been replaced by a frail, frightened woman facing death, knowing she'd severed the most important relationship of her life for reasons she wasn't ready to explain. The diagnosis had created a window that wouldn't remain open long. Whatever truth my mother carried would soon become impossible to share. The question was whether she'd find courage to speak honestly before death closed the door forever. The hospice visitor's badge I wore during those final weeks reads, "Family Member." But family felt increasingly complicated as I watched my mother die while carrying secrets that had poisoned our relationship for 24 years. By December, Her condition required home hospice care, and I made the 4-hour drive 3 times weekly to sit beside the hospital bed installed in their living room. My father, now 76 with his own health problems, struggled to provide adequate care despite visiting nurses. He moved like a ghost, preparing meals no one could eat, organizing medications, offering comfort but no cure, maintaining normal life's pretense while his wife of 52 years faded. She sleeps most of the time, he told me during one visit. But when she's awake, she talks about you. About things from when you were young, memories I haven't heard her mention in decades. For 24 years, my parents had lived as if I'd never existed, editing me from their family narrative so completely that neighbors often expressed shock learning about their estranged son. Now, facing death, my mother was revisiting the relationship she'd spent decades forgetting. As January progressed, my mother's conscious periods became shorter but more intense, as if gathering strength for necessary conversations. During one visit, she asked me to help her set up a careful process around oxygen tubes and 4 lines that had become extensions of her failing body. "Vincent," she whispered, "I need to tell you something before it's too late. About what happened at your trial, about why I said what I said." The words I'd waited 24 years to hear. I pulled my chair closer, heart racing with anticipation of finally understanding the central mystery of my adult life. "I'm listening." She closed her eyes, gathering courage for a confession that would cost everything. I lied on the witness stand. I never saw you with stolen money. I never found cash hidden in your room. Every word of my testimony was false. The admission hit like a physical blow, even though I'd known for decades her testimony couldn't be true. Hearing her acknowledge the lie brought vindication and rage I struggled to contain. "Why?" The question came as a whisper. "Why would you do that to me?" "Because I was protecting someone else. Someone I thought needed protection more than you did. Someone who would have died if I told the truth." "Who?" I demanded, but she was already fading, confession having drained her energy. "Tomorrow," she promised. "I'll tell you everything tomorrow." But tomorrow brought delirium and pain medication, leaving her unable to maintain coherent conversation. For 3 days, I listened to confession fragments emerging between unconsciousness references to gambling debts, suicide threats, impossible choices that had torn her apart. When clarity returned, it came with death's approaching urgency. My father was out when my mother gripped my hand with surprising strength, fixing me with desperate intensity. "Your father," she said, each word carefully enunciated despite weakness. "He was the one who stole the money. He had gambling debts that would have destroyed us. When police arrested you, he wanted to confess, but I knew it would kill him. Prison would have been a death sentence for a 70-year-old man with heart problems." The world tilted. Everything I'd believed about my family, about the crime, defining my life, about my mother's betrayal suddenly rearranged into a pattern I'd never considered. "He was going to commit suicide rather than face prison," she continued, voice growing stronger, as if confession provided energy. "I found the note he'd written, the gun he'd bought. I realized that if I told the truth, I'd lose both my husband and my son him to suicide, you to prison anyway once they investigated and found evidence of his guilt." I stared in stunned silence, trying to process information that changed everything, while explaining nothing about why she'd chosen to sacrifice me instead of finding another solution. "So you decided to let me take the blame." "I decided to protect the family," she replied, tears streaming. "You were young, strong, smart. I believed you could survive prison and rebuild your life. Your father was old, sick, fragile. Prison would have killed him, and suicide would have killed him faster. I made a choice that seemed impossible but necessary." The explanation was so far from anything I'd imagined that I felt disconnected from my emotions, as if listening to someone else's story. The mother who'd raised me had constructed an elaborate lie to protect my father while sacrificing me to save the family unit she valued more than my individual welfare. The conversation was interrupted by my father's return, and my mother immediately closed her eyes, pretending sleep rather than continuing confession in his presence. But something fundamental had shifted. The mystery shaping my adult life was beginning to reveal itself, and with revelation came complexity of emotion I wasn't prepared to handle. That night, I sat in my hotel room trying to understand what I'd learned. The knowledge should have brought relief, vindication, closure. Instead, it brought deeper confusion about love, loyalty, and the terrible choices families face when there are no good options available. My mother had destroyed me to save my father, believing her choice represented the lesser of two evils. But in doing so, she'd created different destruction, one lasting decades and might have continued forever if cancer hadn't forced her to confront the cost of her decision. The hidden bank statements my mother gave me during her final week were kept in a manila envelope taped to the bottom of her jewelry box for 24 years. Her handwriting on the outside read, "For Vincent, the truth," as if she'd always known someday she'd need to provide evidence for the confession she hoped she'd never make. Inside were documents painting a picture of financial desperation I'd never suspected. Bank statements showing escalating overdraft fees, credit card bills with minimum payments barely covering interest, loan applications that had been denied, and most damning, deposits into my father's account matching exactly the amount stolen from the foundation. "I kept everything," my mother whispered as I examined the papers. "Every piece of evidence proving what really happened. I told myself it was insurance in case your father was caught. But really, I think I kept it because I couldn't live with completely erasing what I'd done to you." The dates were devastating in their precision. Each theft from the foundation had been followed within 24 hours by a corresponding deposit into my father's account, money quickly withdrawn in cash, presumably to pay gambling debts whose existence was confirmed by the desperate financial juggling revealed in the statements. My father's gambling addiction had begun years before I'd started working at the foundation, but I'd been too young to recognize the signs. The late-night phone calls, unexplained absences, periods of anxiety followed by brief euphoria, all of it made sense now as behavior of someone trapped in a cycle that had gradually consumed our family's stability. How bad were the debts? $43,000, my mother said barely audibly. Borrowed from people who don't accept bankruptcy as an excuse. They'd been making threats, following him home, calling at all hours. Your father was terrified. The amount seemed impossible. Our family had been solidly middle-class comfortable. Enough that $43,000 represented more than my father's entire annual salary. The idea that he'd accumulated that level of debt without recognition suggested deception requiring careful planning and constant vigilance. When did you find out? 3 months before you were arrested. I discovered loan documents hidden in his workshop. When I confronted him, he broke down completely. He told me about the gambling, the debts, the threats. He said he'd been trying to win back what he'd lost, but every bet made the hole deeper. The bank statements told the rest, with brutal clarity. The first withdrawal from the foundation occurred on a Tuesday in February. Transferred to my father's account Wednesday morning, withdrawn in cash Wednesday afternoon. The pattern continued for 6 months, small amounts first, then larger sums, as creditor pressure intensified. "How did you get my signature on the account documents?" "I traced it," she admitted, words coming like physical confession of betrayal. "From your college applications, scholarship papers. I spent hours practicing your handwriting until I could forge it convincingly. Then I opened the account using your social security number and our address." The methodical deception was more shocking than the original crime. This hadn't been desperate impulse but carefully executed plan, requiring weeks of preparation and absolute willingness to sacrifice me for my father's mistakes. Every signature, every forged document, every lie told to bank employees had been conscious choice to make me the scapegoat. Did anyone else know? No one, my mother said firmly. The evidence was so convincing they never questioned whether you might be innocent. Your father and I were the only ones who knew the truth. The revelation brought strange mixture of vindication and horror. For 24 years, I'd wondered whether there had been conspiracy against me, whether the system was designed to convict innocent people. Instead, it represented something more personal, a family's willingness to sacrifice one member to save another, enabled by my naive trust in people who claimed to love me. Show me the suicide note. She directed me to a different envelope, containing a single sheet covered in my father's handwriting. I cannot live with what I've done to my family. The gambling has destroyed everything I worked to build. I would rather die than go to prison and leave Margaret alone with the shame of what I've become. Reading my father's words, I felt something shift in my understanding of the family dynamic that had shaped my childhood. The quiet, steady man I'd admired had been struggling with demons he'd hidden so completely that even I, living in the same house, had never suspected their existence. He wrote this the night before your arrest, my mother said. I found it on his desk along with the gun he'd bought. When I realized he was planning to kill himself rather than face prosecution, I knew I had to choose between losing both of you and losing just one. The cold calculation in her words was breathtaking. She'd evaluated the situation like a strategic problem, weighing costs and benefits before choosing the solution that preserved what she saw as the most important elements of our family structure. My youth, resilience, potential for recovery had all been factored into an equation, concluding my sacrifice was acceptable if it prevented my father's death. Looking at documents spread across my mother's hospice bed bank statements, forged signatures, the suicide note never sent, I understood I'd been living with fundamentally false understanding of my family for my entire adult life. The people I'd thought I knew had been capable of deception so elaborate and betrayal so profound that they challenged basic assumptions about human nature and family bonds. But I also understood something else. The choice my mother made, however terrible, had been motivated by desperate desire to preserve what remained of her family. She hadn't betrayed me out of malice, but out of twisted form of love, requiring her to sacrifice her son to save her husband. The math of that decision was horrifying, but the emotions behind it were recognizably human. The suicide note draft my mother showed me was written in pencil on paper torn from a legal pad. Words faded but legible after 24 years hidden in her jewelry box. My father's handwriting, usually neat and controlled, was shaky and desperate, as he'd attempted to explain the impossible choice he believed he faced. Margaret, I can't ask you to live with the shame of what I've become. Vincent will be better off without a father who destroyed his family through weakness and selfishness. Please tell him I loved him, even though my actions prove otherwise. The insurance money will help you both start over. I'm sorry for everything. The note was dated the day before my arrest. Reading it 24 years later, I felt complex. Emotions I struggled to name. Anger at my father for creating the crisis through gambling addiction. Grief for desperation that had driven him to consider suicide as preferable to facing consequences. And terrible understanding of the impossible position my mother had found herself in when she discovered this evidence of his intentions. I found it on his desk that night, my mother whispered, along with his service revolver from the army, loaded and ready. He'd written letters to creditors, arranged for policies, even left funeral instructions. He wasn't just threatening suicide, he was actively planning it. The methodical preparation forced me to confront something I'd never considered. His decision to frame me hadn't been motivated by callousness, but by genuine belief that his death would spare our family public scandal humiliation. In his mind, suicide represented sacrifice, taking responsibility in a way that would allow my mother and me to rebuild without the stigma of his criminal conviction. What did you do when you found the note? I panicked. I took the gun and hid it, then sat with him all night trying to talk him out of killing himself. He kept saying prison would destroy him, that he was too old and weak to survive incarceration. That dying would be better for everyone. I tried imagining that conversation, my parents wrestling with options that all led to someone's destruction, weighing relative costs of suicide, imprisonment, and the elaborate deception that would eventually destroy our family differently. He begged me to let him confess, she continued. Even after police arrested you, he wanted to tell them the truth. But by then I'd seen how fragile he was, how completely the stress was breaking him down. He'd lost 15 pounds in 2 weeks, stopped sleeping, developed a tremor that wouldn't go away. I believed admitting his guilt would kill him just as surely as prison would. The physical manifestations of my father's guilt complicated my understanding of his character. This wasn't a man who'd callously transferred blame to his son, but someone being destroyed by knowledge that his mistakes had endangered his family. His willingness to die rather than see me prosecuted suggested a conscience that was intact, even if his judgment had been catastrophically flawed. So you decided to save him by sacrificing me. I decided to save our family by making the choice. That seemed least destructive, she corrected, though the distinction felt meaningless from my perspective. You were 19, intelligent, resilient. I believed you could survive prison and rebuild your life afterward. Your father was 52, with heart problems and diabetes, carrying shame that was literally killing him. Prison would have been a death sentence. The cold calculation in her reasoning was breathtaking, but it was also recognizably maternal. The instinct to protect that had been perverted by circumstances offering no good choices. She'd evaluated our respective capacities for survival and concluded I was more likely to endure trauma and recovery than my father was to endure exposure and imprisonment. Did you ever consider other options? That maybe the family could survive his conviction without destroying me? She nodded, tears streaming. Every day for 24 years. I've replayed that decision thousands of times, imagining different choices, different outcomes. But at the time, with your father talking about suicide and creditors making threats, it felt like the only way to keep anyone in our family alive. Documents she'd preserved told a story supporting her version of events. Medical records from that period showed my father had been treated for anxiety, depression, and stress-related heart palpitations. His gambling debts were documented in threatening letters from collection agencies and individuals, whose language suggested connections to illegal lending operations. Most damning was a letter my father had written to my mother but never sent, found among his papers and dated 3 days after my conviction. I watch our son sitting in that jail cell, and I know I've become a monster. Every night, I dream about telling the truth, but every morning I wake up too weak to face what that would mean. I hate myself for being grateful that someone else is paying for my mistakes, but I'm not strong enough to take that burden back. Reading his private thoughts, I began understanding that my father's silence hadn't been motivated by indifference to my suffering, but by paralyzing combination of shame and self-preservation. He'd wanted to confess, but had been too broken by his own choices to follow through, leaving my mother to carry the weight of their deception alone. He never recovered from the guilt, my mother said, watching me read his unsent letter. Even after you were released, even after we moved away and tried to start over, he carried the knowledge of what we'd done like poison in his system. The drinking started about 5 years after your trial, and it never really stopped. Learning that my conviction had driven him to alcoholism added another layer of complexity to a situation that defied simple moral categorization. The picture that emerged from her confession was of 2 people who'd made a terrible choice and then spent decades being consumed by its consequences. Why now? I asked. Why tell me this when you're dying? Why not take the secret with you? She was quiet so long I thought she might have fallen asleep. But finally she opened her eyes and looked at me with an expression holding 24 years of accumulated sorrow. Because I realized that saving your father's life wasn't worth the cost if it meant you'd never understand that our choice wasn't about love or rejection. We didn't sacrifice you because you mattered less. We sacrificed you because we believed you were strong enough to survive what would have killed him. It was the wrong choice, but it came from love, not indifference. The distinction she was trying to make felt both crucial and irrelevant. Understanding that my parents' betrayal had been motivated by misguided love rather than malicious abandonment changed the emotional context of my trauma, but it didn't erase decades of pain their choice had caused. If anything, it made the betrayal more complicated by revealing it had been committed by people who genuinely believed they were making the least destructive choice available. Your mother told me everything before she died, I said once we were seated. About the gambling, the debts, the suicide note, about who really stole that money. The father's confession letter my mother gave me was written on stationery from their assisted living facility, words carefully composed but never sent, dated 6 months before her cancer diagnosis. His handwriting, shakier with age and alcohol, revealed a man who'd spent 24 years trying to find words adequate to express the magnitude of his betrayal. Vincent, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write down the truth. That has been eating me alive since the day you were arrested. I am the one who stole the money from the foundation. I am the coward who let you go to prison for my crimes. I am the father who destroyed his son's life to save his own worthless skin. After my mother's death in February, I'd maintained a regular contact with my father, visiting monthly to check on his well-being and attempt building some relationship in the time remaining. These visits were awkward, conversations between strangers who shared DNA, but no common understanding of the events that had shaped both our lives. But armed with the truth about his role in my conviction, I drove to his facility with different purpose, to confront the man who'd allowed me to spend 3 years in prison for crimes he'd committed. I found him in the common room playing chess with another resident, movements careful and deliberate in the way of elderly men compensating for failing reflexes. At 78, he was still recognizably the father I remembered, but age and guilt had carved deep lines around his eyes. "Vincent," he said when he saw me, voice carrying surprise and what might have been relief. "I wasn't expecting you today." "We need to talk," I said, voice steady despite emotions churning beneath. "Privately. About things that should have been discussed 24 years ago." Something in my tone conveyed the seriousness of what I'd come to discuss, because he immediately apologized to his chess partner and followed me to a quiet corner of the library. His movements were careful, almost fearful, as if he suspected what conversation was coming. "Your mother told me everything before she died," I said once we were seated. About the gambling, the debts, the suicide note, about who really stole that money. The color drained from his face, and for a moment I thought he might collapse. His hands began to shake, not the tremor of age, but physical manifestation of panic that comes when long-held secrets are suddenly exposed. "She wasn't supposed to tell you," he whispered. We agreed that some truths were too destructive to share. Destructive to whom? I demanded, carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. "To you? Because they've already destroyed me. I spent 3 years in prison, 24 years believing my own mother had betrayed me for no reason. A lifetime building my identity around being abandoned by the people who claimed to love me most." He buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. Watching him break down, I felt a confusing mixture of satisfaction and pity that made it difficult to maintain the anger that had sustained me during the drive. "I wanted to confess," he said through tears. "Every day you were in prison, Every year afterward, I wanted to tell the truth. But I was too much of a coward, and by the time I found the courage, it felt too late to undo the damage we'd caused. The conversation that followed was the most difficult of my adult life. My father's gambling addiction had begun innocently: office pools, occasional track visits, weekend poker games that gradually escalated into serious betting, and ultimately, illegal high-stakes games attracting dangerous people. When you started working at the foundation, I saw an opportunity to solve everything quickly, he admitted. The plan was to borrow just enough to pay off the debts, then return the money before anyone noticed. But borrowing became stealing, and stealing became a pattern I couldn't break. Listening to his explanation, I began understanding how a fundamentally decent man could make choices that seemed incomprehensible from the outside. Addiction had compromised his judgment, fear had motivated increasingly desperate decisions, and shame had prevented him from seeking help. But why let me take the blame? Because I believed I would die in prison, he said simply. Heart problems, diabetes, the stress. I was convinced that admitting my guilt would be tantamount to suicide, and suicide would leave you and your mother alone with the shame of my mistakes. Do you understand what you took from me? I asked, voice breaking. Not just the 3 years in prison, but the 24 years of believing my own family had abandoned me. The impact on my marriage, my children, my ability to trust anyone completely. I know, he said, meeting my eyes for the first time. I know I destroyed your faith in family, in justice, in the basic fairness of the world. I know my choices shaped your entire adult life in ways that can never be undone. And I know that asking for your forgiveness would be selfish when I haven't done anything to deserve it. The acknowledgement of harm without request for absolution was somehow more powerful than an apology would have been. He wasn't asking me to make him feel better about his choices or trying to restore a relationship his betrayal had made impossible. I wrote you letters, he said, pulling a worn envelope from his jacket. Hundreds of them over the years. Confessions, apologies, explanations that never felt adequate. I wrote them to try to stay connected to the son I'd failed so completely. As our conversation ended, my father made one final statement that would haunt me for months. Vincent, I know you'll never forgive me, and you shouldn't. But I need you to know that losing you was the worst consequence of every terrible choice I made. Saving my own life cost me the relationship that mattered most, and I've regretted that trade every day since. Driving home that evening, I realized that confronting my father had provided answers to questions I'd carried for decades, but it had also revealed the complexity of human weakness and the ways that love and betrayal could coexist in the same heart. Understanding his motivations didn't excuse his choices, but it did help me recognize that the people who destroyed my family weren't monsters. They were flawed human beings who'd made impossible decisions under impossible circumstance. The mother's funeral program sits in my desk drawer now, a simple trifold pamphlet that captured nothing of the complexity of the woman we'd gathered to memorialize. Margaret Ann Henderson, beloved wife and mother, read the cover above a photograph from her 60th birthday. That showed her smiling with the kind of practiced warmth that had hidden decades of guilt and regret. The service was small, fewer than 20 people, mostly neighbors and staff from the assisted living facility, who'd known her in her final years but understood nothing of the family trauma that had defined her life. I sat in the front row beside my father, both of us wearing dark suits that felt like costumes for a performance we'd never rehearsed. Isabella and the children had come with me, their presence providing emotional anchor during a ceremony that felt surreal in its conventional grief. Here was a woman being mourned as a devoted mother and wife, while the son she'd betrayed and the husband she protected sat side by side, sharing knowledge of family secrets that would have scandalized the gathered mourners. The pastor, who'd only known my mother during her final months, spoke about her faith, her dedication to family, and her courage in facing terminal illness. He mentioned her regret about an estranged son who'd been unable to reconcile with her before her death, presenting our broken relationship as a common family tragedy rather than the complex betrayal it had actually been. His words were kind but hollow, acknowledging loss without understanding the nature of what had been lost. After the service, as we stood in the cemetery watching my mother's casket being lowered into the ground, my father turned to me with an expression that held 24 years of accumulated sorrow. "She loved you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of dirt falling on polished wood. "Everything she did was motivated by love, even when love led her to make terrible choices." The statement should have provoked anger, but standing there in that place of finality, I felt something closer to exhaustion. The energy required to maintain decades of resentment was enormous, and my mother's death had somehow drained my ability to sustain the rage that had shaped my adult identity. She was gone, taking with her any possibility of direct confrontation or reconciliation, leaving me with the choice of how to carry her memory forward. That evening, in our hotel room, while Isabella helped the children with homework and my father sat alone in his own room processing his grief, I found myself examining the question that would define the next phase of my life. What did forgiveness mean when it came to betrayal this profound? And was forgiveness possible even when the people who'd wronged me had never adequately atoned for their choices? The traditional model of forgiveness requires acknowledgement of harm, genuine remorse, and some form of restitution or changed behavior. My mother had provided acknowledgement and remorse in her final weeks, but death had made restitution impossible. My father had offered acknowledgement and remorse during our confrontation, but the decades of silence that had preceded his confession had amplified the original harm, beyond anything that could be easily repaired. Isabella, who'd spent years watching me struggle with family estrangement, offered perspective that challenged my assumptions about what forgiveness required. "Vincent," she said as we lay in bed that night, "you've been waiting 24 years for your parents to give you something that would make forgiveness possible. But maybe forgiveness isn't about what they give you. Maybe it's about what you give yourself." Her words resonated with insights I'd gained through years of victim advocacy work. I'd counseled countless clients who'd been harmed by people who would never acknowledge their wrongdoing, never express genuine remorse, never provide the closure the victims desperately sought. The most successful healing I'd witnessed had come from people who'd learned to forgive independently of their perpetrators' actions, choosing emotional freedom over the exhausting work of maintaining permanent resentment. But how do you forgive people who destroyed your family and then spent decades lying about it? I asked. "You don't forgive them for their sake," she replied. "You forgive them for yours, and for Michael's and Emma's. Because carrying that anger is poisoning your ability to be fully present in the family you've built." The conversation continued for hours, touching on themes I'd explored professionally but never applied personally. Forgiveness as a choice rather than a feeling. Healing as a process that could occur independently of justice. The difference between pardoning harmful behavior and refusing to let that behavior continue damaging your life. Over the following weeks, as I processed my mother's death and my father's confession, I began to notice how my family trauma had shaped my relationships in ways I'd never fully acknowledged. My hypervigilance about loyalty, my tendency to interpret disagreement as abandonment, my difficulty trusting people completely, even when they'd given me no reason for suspicion, all of it could be traced back to the wound my parents had inflicted when they chose to sacrifice me for their own survival. Michael, now 7, had begun asking questions about why his grandparents had never been part of his life. Emma, at 4, was less curious but occasionally wondered aloud why some children had grandparents who visited while others didn't. Their questions forced me to consider what legacy I wanted to create from my family's dysfunction, whether I would pass down the resentment and estrangement that had defined my relationship with my parents, or find a way to break the cycle that had damaged multiple generations. The decision to pursue forgiveness wasn't sudden or dramatic. It evolved gradually through conversations with Isabella, reflection on my professional experience with trauma recovery, and recognition that my children deserved a father who wasn't defined by his wounds. Forgiveness began to feel less like capitulation to people who'd wronged me and more like claiming the right to define my own emotional landscape independently of their choices. The process was complicated by my father's continued presence in my life. Unlike my mother, whose death had created natural closure, he remained alive and occasionally available for the relationship that we'd never successfully built. Our monthly visits continued, but they took on a different character as I gradually released the expectation that he would somehow provide adequate restitution for the harm he'd caused. "I don't need you to suffer for what you did," I told him during one of these visits 3 months after my mother's funeral. "I need you to understand that the family we might have had is gone forever, but that doesn't mean we can't figure out what kind of relationship is possible with the time that's left." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know I can't undo the past or earn your forgiveness, but if you're willing to try building something new, I'd like to be part of that." The relationship we constructed wasn't built on restored trust or forgotten betrayal, but on acceptance of who we actually were rather than who we might have been under different circumstances. He was a flawed man who'd made devastating choices and spent decades living with their consequences. I was his son who'd survived those choices and built a life that honored resilience over resentment. Forgiveness, I discovered, wasn't the moment of resolution, but an ongoing choice to prioritize healing over revenge, growth over stagnation, the future over the past. It didn't require me to minimize the harm my parents had caused or pretend that their love had justified their betrayal. It required me to recognize that my continued anger was hurting me more than it was hurting them, and that my children deserved a father who'd learned to transform pain into wisdom rather than carrying it like a permanent wound. The funeral program in my desk drawer reminds me that death creates its own form of forgiveness, not because the dead deserve pardon, but because the living deserve peace. My mother carried her guilt to the grave, unable to fully repair the damage her choices had caused, but finally honest about the motivations behind them. Understanding those motivations didn't excuse her betrayal, but it did help me recognize the humanity behind choices that had seemed inhuman for so long. Forgiveness became possible when I stopped expecting it to restore what had been lost and started appreciating what it could provide. Freedom from the exhausting work of permanent anger. Space for relationships built on choice rather than blood. And the ability to model for my children that healing is possible even after the deepest betrayals. The choice to forgive wasn't about my parents. It was about reclaiming the right to define my own story based on who I'd become rather than what had been done to me. The family photo hanging in our living room shows 4 people who chose each other rather than simply being born to each other. Taken last Christmas in our backyard. It captures Isabella and me with Michael, now 10, and Emma, 7, all laughing. It's something Michael had said while the camera timer counted down. The image represents everything I'd learned about building family bonds based on trust, honesty, and unconditional love, principles absent from my childhood but foundational to my parenting. The decision to tell my children age-appropriate versions of the truth about my family history came when Michael started asking persistent questions about why he'd never met my parents. At 10, he was old enough to understand concepts like crime and punishment, prison, and rehabilitation, but too young to grasp the full complexity of family betrayal. "Dad," he said one evening as I tucked him into bed, "Tommy at school says everyone has grandparents, even if they live far away or died before you were born, but you never talk about yours. Did something bad happen to them?" The question I'd been preparing for since his birth had finally arrived. Isabella and I had discussed this moment countless times, agreeing that our children deserved truth appropriate to their developmental stage, rather than the kind of family secrets that had poisoned my childhood. "Something bad did happen," I said, sitting on the edge of his bed. "When I was young, someone committed a crime, and I was blamed for it. I had to go to prison, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. My parents believed I was guilty, and that made them too ashamed to stay in touch with me after I got out." Michael's eyes widened with the shock that comes when children first learn that the world can be fundamentally unfair. "But if you didn't do it, why didn't they believe you?" Sometimes people make mistakes about what's true. Sometimes they believe things that aren't accurate, or they make choices based on fear instead of love. My parents were dealing with problems I didn't know about, and those problems made them unable to support me when I needed them most. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Michael asking direct questions children pose when trying to understand adult complexity. Each question required balancing honesty with age appropriateness, explaining concepts like wrongful conviction and family dysfunction without overwhelming him with details that might damage his sense of security. "Does this mean you might abandon us if we get in trouble?" he asked finally, getting to the heart of his fear. "Never," I said firmly. "What happened with my parents taught me how important it is for families to stick together, especially when times are difficult. Mom and I will always love you, and Emma, no matter what happens, no matter what mistakes you make, no matter what problems we face together." Emma's version of the conversation came 6 months later, tailored to her 7-year-old understanding, but covering the same essential themes. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. Sometimes families make mistakes that hurt each other, but our family was built on different principles that prioritized honesty and unconditional love. Both conversations were difficult but necessary, establishing a foundation of truth that allowed my children to understand their family history without being burdened by its full complexity. They knew their father had overcome serious challenges, that he worked helping other people who'd faced similar problems, and that the love they experienced in our home was something I'd learned to value because I'd lived without it. The legal consultation about clearing my criminal record came at Isabella's suggestion, though I'd resisted the idea for months. The lawyer I consulted reviewed the evidence, clearly establishing my innocence, but explained that proving innocence and achieving legal exoneration were different things. The process could take years and might not succeed despite the strength of my evidence. Instead of pursuing expensive and uncertain legal remedies, I made a different choice: to focus on how my experience could benefit others facing similar challenges. My work had already demonstrated that personal transformation could occur independently of legal vindication, that people could build meaningful lives despite wrongful convictions and family abandonment. I developed programs specifically for people dealing with family estrangement, wrongful conviction, and the intersection of criminal justice involvement with family breakdown. The goal isn't always to restore what was lost, I explained during presentations. Sometimes the goal is to build something new that honors what you've learned from surviving impossible circumstances. My father's death came 18 months after my mother's, peaceful but lonely in the assisted living facility. I was with him when he died, holding his hand as he slipped away while mumbling apologies for choices he'd made decades earlier. His funeral was even smaller than my mother's, attended by facility staff and a few distant relatives who knew nothing of our family's complex history. Standing at his grave, I felt a mixture of grief and relief that surprised me with its intensity. Grief for the father-son relationship we'd never fully restored, for the grandfather my children would never know. Relief that his suffering was over, that the guilt consuming his final decades had finally been laid to rest. The peace that came with my parents' deaths wasn't the result of forgiveness alone, but of recognition that some relationships can't be fully repaired, and some wounds can't be completely healed. What can be healed is the impact those wounds have on other relationships, the ways that past trauma limits present possibilities. Michael and Emma will grow up in a family that prioritizes honesty over harmony, authenticity over appearance, chosen bonds over biological obligations. They'll understand that love requires action rather than just feeling, that loyalty means supporting each other through difficulties rather than abandoning each other when problems arise. The photograph in our living room captures more than a moment of family happiness. It represents the conscious choice to create something healthy from the wreckage of something broken. Every day, Isabella and I make decisions about how to respond to conflicts, handle stress, model the kind of relationships we want our children to have in their adult lives. The cycle breaks not through dramatic gestures or perfect resolution, but through thousands of small choices made over years. The choice to tell the truth, even when uncomfortable, to apologize when you've made mistakes, to prioritize relationships over pride, to model the kind of love that remains constant, even when circumstances change. Breaking the cycle means recognizing that the family you create is more important than the family you came from, and that the greatest gift you can give your children is the security of knowing they are loved, without conditions. Decharacterized my birth family to demonstrate that healing is possible, and that families can be rebuilt on stronger foundations than the ones that were damaged or destroyed. The cycle breaks not through dramatic gestures or perfect resolution, but through thousands of small choices made over years and decades. The choice to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable, to apologize when you've made mistakes, to prioritize relationships over pride, to model the kind of love that remains constant even when circumstances change. Breaking the cycle means recognizing that the family you create is more important than the family you came from, and that the greatest gift you can give your children is the security of knowing they are loved without conditions or reservations. Vincent's journal sits open on my desk as I write this final reflection. Its pages filled with 24 years of processing trauma, building relationships, and learning to transform pain into purpose. The leather cover is worn from handling, the binding loose from years of documenting the journey from betrayal to understanding, from anger to acceptance, from isolation to the deep connections that now define my life. The final entry, written last week, captures something I never thought possible during those early days of family estrangement. Today, Michael asked me to help him with a school project about family heroes. Without hesitation, he chose me. Not because I'm perfect, but because I've shown him that people can overcome terrible circumstances and still choose love, honesty, and resilience. For the first time in my adult life, I feel genuinely proud of the father I've become. Sitting here at 47, surrounded by artifacts of a life rebuilt from devastation, I'm struck by how completely my understanding of family, justice, and forgiveness has evolved since that terrible day when my mother took the witness stand against me. The young man who went to prison believing families were bound by unconditional loyalty has been replaced by someone who understands that the strongest bonds are those we choose to create through conscious action. The work that grew from my personal trauma has expanded beyond anything I could have imagined. Our organization now operates in 12 states, providing services that help thousands of people annually. The model we've developed, addressing the intersection of criminal justice, involvement with family breakdown, has been adopted by organizations across the country, proving that personal wounds can be transformed into tools for healing others. Just last month, I received a letter from a woman whose son had been wrongfully convicted of assault. She'd attended one of my presentations, and my story had given her courage to support her son throughout his appeals process. His conviction was eventually overturned, and he's now rebuilding his life with his family's unwavering support, the kind of support I'd never received but had learned to provide for others. Isabella and I celebrated our 15th wedding anniversary. Last month with quiet dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date. Sitting across from her, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude for her patience during the years when I was still learning to trust completely, still working through the impact of family betrayal on my ability to believe in permanent love. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked her that evening. "Marrying someone with so much baggage?" She smiled with the same directness that had characterized our relationship from the beginning. "Vincent, your history didn't make you damaged goods. It made you someone who understands the value of authentic relationships. I didn't marry you despite your past. I married you because of who your past had shaped you to become." Michael, now 13, has inherited his mother's directness and his father's sense of justice. He's considering a career in law, motivated partly by family stories about fighting for people who've been failed by systems they trusted. Emma, at 10, shows emotional intelligence suggesting she might follow her parents into social work. Both children understand their family was built intentionally by people who'd survived difficult circumstances. They know their paternal grandparents. Only through carefully edited stories, they acknowledge loss without burdening them with details that might undermine their security. They understand their father spent time in prison for something he didn't do, that families sometimes make mistakes that hurt each other, and that the love they experience daily is something I learned to value because I'd lived without it. The most profound shift in my understanding has been recognizing that justice doesn't always require punishment, that healing can occur without revenge, and that the greatest victories are often those that prevent future harm rather than addressing past wounds. My parents' betrayal was never prosecuted, never formally acknowledged, never addressed through the legal system. But justice of a different kind occurred through the relationships I built, the people I helped, and the family legacy I created from the wreckage of my childhood. The criminal justice system that convicted me based on fabricated evidence never acknowledged its error, never provided compensation, never reformed the processes that made my wrongful conviction possible. But institutional failure has motivated personal success, channeling anger into advocacy, that has prevented similar injustices and demonstrated that individuals can create change even when systems resist reform. Looking back on the 24-year journey from betrayal to understanding, I'm struck by how completely my definition of family has evolved. The people who share my DNA proved incapable of providing unconditional love when it was most needed. While the family I've built demonstrates daily that loyalty is a choice rather than an accident of birth, the question that haunted me for decades, why my mother had testified against me, finally has an answer that makes her betrayal comprehensible, if not forgivable. She'd faced an impossible choice between family members she loved, choosing to sacrifice the one she believed was most likely to survive the consequences. Her choice was wrong, but it was motivated by desperation rather than malice, misguided love rather than actual abandonment. Understanding her motivations didn't minimize the harm her choice caused, but it helped me recognize the humanity behind decisions that had seemed inhuman for so long. The greatest gift of her deathbed confession wasn't vindication, I'd known. I was innocent for 24 years, but the relief of finally understanding that my family's abandonment hadn't been based on my unworthiness, but on their inability to handle an impossible situation with wisdom and courage. To anyone carrying the weight of family betrayal, I want you to know that understanding why someone hurt you doesn't require you to excuse their choices, but it might help you recognize that their actions often say more about their limitations than about your worth. Forgiveness, when it comes, isn't about pardoning people who've wronged us. It's about refusing to let their choices continue limiting our possibilities. Family isn't just the people who share your blood. It's the people who choose to love you consistently, who support you through difficulties, who help you become the best version of yourself. Sometimes the family that raises you isn't capable of providing unconditional love, But that doesn't mean you're incapable of creating and receiving it with people who choose to see your value. The truth that my mother finally shared changed everything I thought I knew about justice, forgiveness, and the price of family bonds. But the most important truth I've learned isn't about what was done to me. It's about what I've chosen to do with the life I rebuilt from devastation. Some truths are worth waiting 20 years to hear, but the most important truths are the ones we discover by refusing to let other people's failures define our worth or limit our capacity for creating meaningful relationships. The greatest victory isn't always getting the answers we've been seeking. Sometimes it's learning to build something beautiful while we're waiting for understanding that may never come. If you've carried the weight of family betrayal, know that you're not alone, that healing is possible, and that the family you create can be stronger than the one that failed you. Like and subscribe not just to this story, but to the belief that your past doesn't have to determine your future, and that sometimes the most profound love comes from people who choose you rather than people who are simply related to you.